I went on following the search party up until September 1969, but I never found my father's remains.
The bodies found in the mass graves were solemnly reburied by the South Vietnamese government. Bodies of officials, army officers, priests, students. Some who bore no visible marks of violence had presumably been buried alive. "2,800 bodies were eventually found, and the massacre prompted U.S. and South Vietnamese officials to predict a bloodbath if the communists won the war. For the communists, however, the Tet Offensive fell short of their expectations.
At that time in the North, we had devoted our resources and our energy to the liberation of the South in 1968. And when this could not be achieved, we certainly felt a little let down.
Looking back at it now, it is clear that the first objective, the liberation of the South, was not accomplished. But at that time, we did attack the command centers of the American forces and the puppet regime in the urban areas as well as in the provinces. We attacked the provincial headquarters, the Saigon Presidential Palace, the various secret police headquarters, and the radio stations. And in Saigon, we fought our way into the American Embassy, which was the most important American headquarters in the South. We were able to occupy all these places, but we could not hold them. Therefore, we did not gain enough time for the people to stage their general uprising.
For us, you know, strategy is never purely military. Our strategy is always a general and integrated strategy, simultaneously military, political, and diplomatic. Thus, the Tet Offensive of 1968 obviously had an objective that was both military and political.
As a military operation, the offensive had failed. The Southern Viet Cong guerrilla forces had surfaced, to be killed or captured in large numbers. After 1968, the war was increasingly fought by North Vietnamese as a conventional conflict. The political goal of forcing President Thu to accept a coalition government also failed.
What they have realized in the city, that the people was against them. So I believe that the general uprising, they have a hope, have not happened. They have met with the anti-communist sentiment from the people in the city. So they fell in both countryside and city.
But even though it was a considerable military setback for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong out there on the ground, it was in effect a brilliant political victory for them here in the United States. I'm not sure I fully understand the reasons why that should have occurred. But it became very clear after the Tet Offensive that many people at the grassroots, such as my cousins in Cherokee County, finally came to the conclusion that if we could not tell them when this war was going to end, and we couldn't in any good faith, that we might as well chuck it.
The Tet Offensive came as a brutal surprise to President Johnson and all of his advisors. We had been led to believe that the Viet Cong were pretty well defanged by that period, that the pacification program had worked very well, that most of the villages in South Vietnam were secure, and that it was virtually impossible for the Viet Cong to rise to the heights that they did in 1968.
The shock of the Tet attacks forced Johnson, the commander-in-chief, to seek refuge in the military. Johnson, the president, said nothing to the nation. Tet had crystallized the dilemma of the war. Johnson wanted victory, but his enemy, though rebuffed, was still not defeated. Could he win now without expanding the war and committing more troops?
At the time of the Tet Offensive, I asked for only those troops that were on the way to me anyway, that had been promised and had been organized, and I asked that they be accelerated.
Johnson approved this request and sent off an airborne unit. But by now, Vietnam was draining America's overall military force. Johnson's generals pressed him to take a step he had always resisted, to call up the reserves, to gird the nation for a bigger war.
Mr. Johnson then sent a message, if you need further reinforcements, please call for them. I took no steps in that regard until General Wheeler came over. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Wheeler told me that it was a good prospect that the reserves would be mobilized, that the strategy would be changed. And if reserves are mobilized and our strategy was changed to be an offensive strategy that would break down some of the geographical barriers of Laos and Cambodia and allow us to take the war to the enemy in a more effective way through the bombing campaign, what would I want to bring the war to an end? It was in the context then of a contingency plan based on an assumption of a decision, and it was not a request per se.
But it was presented as Westmoreland's request for 206,000 troops for Vietnam. General Earl Wheeler said they were needed to stop another attack. In fact, Wheeler planned to keep half the troops at home to replenish the depleted reserves. Another advisor wanted to use the troops to invade North Vietnam.
I thought that the extra troops would be justified only if we used them in a very active policy to force an end to the war on the ground through putting forces into North Vietnam as far as north as Vinh and blocking off on the ground with U.S. forces the multiple trails in Laos.
Johnson turned the troop request over to Clark Clifford, his new Secretary of Defense, a trusted advisor and supporter of the war from the beginning.
President Johnson appointed a task force as soon as I went into the Pentagon and named me chairman of the task force. The reason was that the military had specifically requested 206,000 more troops be sent to Vietnam. He wanted that analyzed. He wanted us to determine how the troops could be gathered and sent, what the social, political, economic impact might be on the United States.
The troop request came at a time when Johnson was concerned about Khe Sanh, where the Marine garrison was still besieged. Johnson believed the North Vietnamese still planned a major assault against Khe Sanh. The Marines, surrounded and outnumbered, were enduring deadly artillery barrages as they waited for the North Vietnamese to storm the base.
Now, to meet the needs of these fighting men, we shall do whatever is required. Make no mistake about it. I don't want a man in here to go back home thinking otherwise. We are going to win.
Johnson did meet the needs of his men at Khe Sanh. He unleashed the Air Force against the North Vietnamese encircling the base in one of the most intensive bombing campaigns in history. By early March, assured that Khe Sanh was safe and the Tet Offensive repelled, Johnson quietly shelved the request for 206,000 troops. But the troop request had deeply influenced his new Secretary of Defense.
I know for 3 full days I spent down in the tank with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where you sit with all of the communications devices that go all over the world. We had long talks. How long would it take? They didn't know. How many more troops would it take? They didn't know. Would 206,000 answer the demand? They didn't know. Might there be more? Yes, there might be more. So when it was all over, I said, what is the plan to win the war in Vietnam? Well, the only plan is that ultimately the attrition will wear down the North Vietnamese and they will have had enough. Is there any indication that we've reached that point? No, there isn't. As a result of that kind of interview and that kind of information, before the final examination was over and we submitted our report to President Johnson, I had turned against the war.
But we don't plan to surrender either, and we don't plan to pull out either, and we don't plan to let people influence us and pressure and force us to divide our nation in a time of national peril. The hour is here.
I then decided